The galaxy had known fear before, but nothing like the Volcar. Stories of this brutal race traveled faster than light itself, carried by refugees fleeing ravaged planets, whispered across council halls, and etched into the fading records of lost civilizations. The Volcar did not bargain, did not compromise, and certainly did not retreat. They conquered, consumed, and moved on, leaving worlds broken in their wake. Towering beings with obsidian-colored scales and sharp, gleaming eyes, the Volcar epitomized raw, primal strength. Their technology, while not superior to other galactic civilizations, was built for war, optimized for destruction and domination. For centuries, their relentless campaigns had left entire star systems lifeless, planets reduced to husks, and their enemies either enslaved or extinct. The Galactic Council, an ancient assembly representing hundreds of civilizations, was no stranger to threats. Over millennia, they had navigated galactic crises through diplomacy, alliances, and military coalitions. But this was different. The Volcar were not interested in trade agreements or territorial negotiations. They had no political demands. Their sole objective was conquest. Now, with the Volcar fleets advancing deeper into civilized space, even the most powerful members of the Council were beginning to realize that everything they had built could soon fall. In the Grand Council chamber, tension crackled through the air like a live wire. Representatives from hundreds of races filled the vast circular room, their voices blending into an indistinguishable murmur of fear and anger. Normally a place of measured debate, today it felt like a sinking ship. As the reports poured in, another outer rim colony devastated, another border station overwhelmed, the mood grew increasingly desperate. "We cannot negotiate with the Volcar," an insectoid diplomat buzzed, wings twitching nervously. "Every envoy we've sent has been slaughtered before delivering their message." A reptilian representative slammed his clawed hand on the table, his scales shimmering with frustration. "Then we must prepare for war. Gather every fleet, conscript every able fighter. If we do not stop them at our borders, there will be nothing left to save." The room erupted into chaos, various species shouting over each other, each proposing a different form of desperate action. Fear was palpable, hanging thick in the air like smoke. The council president, an ancient being from a race of near-immortals, tried to restore order, but it was clear that panic had already taken root. No one had any answers, only fears and speculations about how long they could hold off the inevitable. Then, amid the cacophony, the human delegation stood up, and the room fell eerily silent. Humans were a relatively new addition to the Galactic Council. For most of the galaxy's history, Earth had been considered an insignificant backwater, a planet too young and inexperienced to play a meaningful role in interstellar affairs. But in the last century, humans had proven themselves resourceful, unpredictable, and stubborn to a fault. It was these qualities that both intrigued and irritated the older, more established members of the Council. Now, as the human ambassador, Captain Elias Kane, rose to speak, every eye turned toward him, curious about what these newcomers had to say in the face of such overwhelming danger. Kane was not an imposing figure by galactic standards. He was tall for a human, but compared to the towering beings around him, he seemed almost diminutive. Yet there was a calm confidence in his posture, a steady gaze that suggested he knew something the rest of the council did not. Clad in a simple uniform, devoid of ostentation, Kane stepped forward and surveyed the room. When he spoke, his voice was measured, neither too loud nor too soft, but it carried an air of quiet authority that demanded attention. "We understand the threat posed by the Volcar," Kane began, his tone even and composed, "and we share your concerns, but charging blindly into war will only hasten our downfall." The room bristled at the suggestion, and several representatives voiced their displeasure. "You suggest we do nothing?" one alien snarled, its many eyes narrowing in disbelief. Kane shook his head. What I suggest is something far more difficult than war. I suggest that we try to understand them." A wave of disbelief swept through the chamber. Mutters and hisses filled the air, but Kane continued, undeterred. "The Volcar are not mindless beasts. They have a culture, a way of life, even if it seems incomprehensible to us. If we rush into battle without knowing what drives them, without understanding why they fight, we are doomed to fail." The council erupted again, voices clashing in anger and frustration. "They fight because they crave destruction," a representative shouted. "What more is there to understand?" Kane raised his hand, and slowly the room fell silent again. "We don't know that," he said firmly. "We assume it, yes, but assumptions won't save us. Information will. Strategy will." There was a pause, a beat of silence in which Kane's words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. It was a bold proposal, reckless, some might say. The idea of engaging with the Volcar on any level other than combat seemed absurd, even dangerous, but there was something about the way Kane spoke, the way he refused to be rattled, that gave his words weight. "Humans," he continued, "have fought wars we were not meant to win. We have survived against enemies far stronger and far more numerous, and we've done it not just with weapons, but with wit, with understanding. We've learned to turn enemies into allies, to see opportunities where others see only threats." His gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of each representative in turn. "I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm saying it's the only chance we have." The council president leaned forward, her ancient eyes narrowing as she regarded the human ambassador. "And what exactly do you propose, Captain Kane?" Kane allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "We'll need to meet the Volcar on their terms. We'll need to send someone into their territory, someone who can speak not just with words but with actions." The president's brow furrowed. "You intend to send an envoy?" Kane nodded. "Not just an envoy. A message. We need to show them that we're not afraid, that we understand strength, because strength isn't just about power. It's about knowing when not to use it." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Kane's words settling over the assembled representatives like a heavy mantle. It was an audacious plan, borderline insane by some standards, but there was also a strange, undeniable logic to it. The council president slowly inclined her head. "Very well, Captain Kane, you have your chance. But be warned, if this fails, we will not have the luxury of a second attempt." Kane gave a curt nod. "We won't need one." As the meeting adjourned, murmurs of uncertainty rippled through the chamber. Some still doubted the humans' plan, while others, quietly and reluctantly, began to hope. And in the dark expanse of space, the Volcar fleet continued its advance, unaware that, for the first time in their long and bloody history, they were about to face an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. An enemy who did not fear them. An enemy who intended to change everything. The weight of the Galactic Council's decision hung heavy in the atmosphere, but there was no time for hesitation. Captain Elias Kane had barely left the council chamber before the next phase of his plan was set into motion. Back on board the UEN Resolute, a sleek diplomatic cruiser stationed just beyond the council's orbit, Commander Maria Vega awaited her orders. She was known for her decisiveness and a knack for operating on the edge of impossible missions, qualities that made her the perfect candidate for what Kane had in mind. "Are we really doing this?" Vega asked over the secure communication channel, her voice laced with curiosity and a hint of amusement. She leaned back in her seat, drumming her fingers on the console in front of her. Kane's image flickered on the holoscreen, his expression unreadable. "We are," he confirmed. "It's time to show them what humans are made of." And just like that, the wheels were set in motion. The UN Resolute activated its engines, pushing through the emptiness of space toward the outer edge of the known galaxy, toward Volcar territory. This wasn't just a mission, it was a declaration. Humanity, the newest and most underestimated members of the Galactic Council, was doing what no other race dared to, entering the lion's den willingly, without weapons drawn. The mission was clear: extend an olive branch, gauge the Volcar's response, and, if possible, lay the groundwork for something more than war. But there was no room for mistakes. If this first encounter went badly, it would be humanity's last. As the Resolute crossed into the Volcar-controlled sector, the ship's systems began detecting ominous signals, proximity alerts, warnings from automated satellites, and the unmistakable signatures of warships on patrol. The crew felt the tension thick in the air, a quiet but constant reminder that they were trespassing in hostile space. Commander Vega paced the bridge, her dark eyes scanning every readout, every transmission. The crew knew better than to disturb her when she was in this state, thinking 5 steps ahead, preparing for every scenario, no matter how improbable. "Status?" she asked sharply. "Multiple Volcar ships on intercept course," her communications officer replied. "They'll reach us in less than 20 minutes. Vega nodded, her mind racing. There was no protocol for this, no playbook for negotiating with a race that had never accepted negotiation. She glanced at the tactical display, where 3 large Volcar warships were already highlighted in red, their paths converging on the Resolute, like wolves closing in on prey. "Hold our course," Vega ordered. "No evasive maneuvers. Keep shields down." The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances, but obeyed. In any other scenario, they would have raised shields and readied weapons by now. But this mission wasn't about firepower. It was about sending a message that humans were not afraid. As the enemy ships drew closer, Vega activated the ship's main communications array and instructed her comms officer to send a simple transmission on an open channel. The message was bold, bordering on reckless. "We come unarmed. We wish to speak." The Volcar response was immediate. One of the approaching ships, larger and more ominous than the others, transmitted a brief but clear message. "Your request is irrelevant. Surrender or be destroyed." Vega expected as much. The Volcar had never known diplomacy, but this was no ordinary negotiation. It was a calculated gamble. Vega leaned forward, her voice calm and deliberate. "Transmit again," she instructed. "Same message, same frequency." The comms officer hesitated only a moment before complying. The message was sent again, floating across the vast emptiness of space to the approaching Volcar fleet. Seconds stretched into minutes. Vega could feel the tension tightening around her crew, each second of silence a potential countdown to annihilation. Then, without warning, the lead Volcar ship, a hulking dreadnought twice the size of the Resolute, came to a sudden halt. Its escorts slowed in unison, maintaining a cautious distance. "They're holding position," the tactical officer whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. For the first time, Vega allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Good, now let's talk." The view screen flickered, and a figure appeared, a Volcar warlord, clad in heavy armor that glinted menacingly under the ship's lights. His face was hidden behind a brutal-looking helmet, with only his cold, predatory eyes visible. "I am Warlord Zorvac," the alien growled. "State your purpose, human, before I tire of this game." Vega inclined her head slightly, keeping her expression neutral. "We're here to extend a hand," she said. "We believe there's more to gain from understanding each other than from endless war." Zorvac's laugh was harsh, like metal scraping against stone. Humans, always trying to speak when they should fight. "Perhaps," Vega replied evenly, "but we've learned that not all victories are won on the battlefield. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when not to fight. The Volcar warlord regarded her in silence for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see past the surface of her words. "Bold words," he muttered. "You speak as if you are my equal." "I speak as one who understands strength," Vega said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You value power, so do we, but power without purpose is just chaos." There was a pause, a long, heavy silence in which the entire crew held their breath. Vega knew she was walking a razor's edge, but she had to push forward. This was the moment that would decide everything. "You've conquered many worlds," she continued, "but what have you gained from them? More enemies? More wars? What if there was another way?" Zorvak tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words for the first time. "You are not like the others," he said at last. "They cower, you do not." Vega allowed herself a small smile. "No, we don't." The warlord leaned closer to the screen, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Very well, human. You have piqued my curiosity." He paused as if weighing a decision. "We will meet. But know this. If you disappoint me, your death will be swift." Vega gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Understood. We'll be ready." With that, the communication ended, and the screen went dark. The bridge crew exhaled collectively, the tension that had gripped them finally releasing. "That was unexpected," the tactical officer muttered, still processing what had just happened. "Unexpected is good," Vega replied. "Unexpected means we're still in the game." As the Volcar ships adjusted their course to escort the Resolute deeper into their territory, Vega turned back to her crew, her expression grim but determined. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "We're walking into the unknown, but if we play this right, we might just change everything." And so humanity's bold gambit continued, the first step in a dangerous dance with a race that had never known anything but conquest. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time the Volcar had paused. And in that hesitation, Vega saw the faintest glimmer of possibility, a chance to reshape the future. The UN Resolute drifted deeper into Volcar space, surrounded by a formidable escort of alien warships. The tension on the bridge was thick as the humans monitored every movement of the Volcar vessels, each of which bristled with weapon systems powerful enough to obliterate them in seconds. Yet, Commander Maria Vega remained calm. They had made it this far. Now, they needed to prove they were worth more as allies than as enemies. "Maintain our current heading," Vega ordered. "No sudden moves. Let them see that we trust the process." Her officers exchanged uneasy glances but complied. It was an act of psychological warfare just as much as diplomacy. Trust without fear was something the Volcar did not understand, and that was exactly what Vega was counting on. The Resolute entered a dark nebula, an uncharted region filled with swirling gases and gravitational distortions that made scanners unreliable. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and everyone on the bridge knew it. "Volcar ships are adjusting formation," the tactical officer reported. "They're boxing us in." Vega leaned forward, eyes sharp as she studied the tactical display. "Let them," she said softly. "They want us to think we're trapped." Her confidence unsettled the crew, but Vega knew exactly what she was doing. The Volcar excelled in brute force and intimidation, but they lacked subtlety. This encounter was not a battle of ships and weapons, it was a contest of minds. As the Resolute's engines hummed quietly, Vega tapped into the ship's long-range sensors, hoping to gather whatever fragmented data she could from their distorted readings. The Volcar fleet kept a tight formation around them, like a predator toying with its prey, but something about their positioning piqued her curiosity. "Pull up a schematic of their escort patterns," she instructed. The ship's AI obliged, displaying a three-dimensional model of the Volcar's movements over the past hour. Vega studied it intently, and soon enough she spotted the flaw. "They're predictable," she murmured, almost to herself. They're assuming we're trying to escape." Her communications officer raised an eyebrow. "We're not?" Vega allowed herself a sly grin. "Number. We're going to let them think they have us exactly where they want us." Just then, a Volcar transmission crackled over the comms channel. It was Warlord Zorvac, his voice a low growl that carried both amusement and menace. "You have done well to make it this far, human, but you cannot outmaneuver us. Your ship is outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender, and we may allow you to live." Vega responded without hesitation, her voice calm and measured. "If you truly believed we were beaten, you wouldn't have opened a communication channel." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether Vega's boldness would pay off or get them all killed. Then Zorvac's rumbling laugh echoed over the comms. "Bold. Foolish but bold. Very well, human. Let us see how long your cleverness lasts." The transmission ended, and the Volcar warships resumed their ominous maneuvering. Vega knew they had precious little time before the aliens lost patience, and when that happened, they would attack without mercy. She turned to her crew, her expression serious. "We're going to pull a feint," she said. "Make them think we're retreating, and when they close in to finish us off, we'll show them what human ingenuity really looks like." The tactical officer frowned. "Commander, with all due respect, how do we outmaneuver a fleet this size?" Vega's grin was razor-sharp. "By using the one thing we have that they don't, unpredictability." She began issuing rapid-fire orders. "Helm, prepare for evasive maneuvers. Engineering, I want full power to the thrusters, but keep the shields offline. We need them to believe we're panicking. Tactical, ready a sensor pulse. We'll blind their systems for just long enough to make our move." As the crew scrambled to execute her commands, Vega kept her gaze locked on the tactical display. The Volcar ships were closing in, their formation tightening like a noose. This was the critical moment. "On my mark," she said quietly, her hands steady on the armrests of her chair. 3, 2, 1, now!" The Resolute's engines roared to life, and the ship shot forward, diving toward the nearest gravitational anomaly in the nebula. The sudden acceleration caught the Volcar off guard, and for a split second, their ships hesitated, just as Vega had predicted. "Tactical, fire the pulse!" A burst of electromagnetic energy rippled through the nebula, disrupting the Volcar ship's sensors and communications. The alien vessels faltered, struggling to recalibrate their systems in the chaotic environment. "Helm, execute the turn. Now!" Vega barked. The Resolute spun on its axis, using the gravitational pull of the anomaly to slingshot around the Volcar fleet. In one smooth, audacious maneuver, they went from being surrounded to slipping behind enemy lines. "We're clear!" the pilot exclaimed, disbelief and exhilaration in his voice. The Volcar fleet scrambled to adjust their formation, but by the time their systems came back online, the Resolute was already out of their firing range, cutting a path through the nebula's swirling mists. Vega allowed herself a moment to savor the victory. They had outmaneuvered the Volcar, something no one else had ever managed to do, but she knew the battle was far from over. "Send a transmission to Zorvac," she ordered, her voice steady. "Tell him we look forward to our next meeting." The message was sent, and moments later, a reply came through. Zorvac's voice was low and dangerous, but there was an undercurrent of something unexpected: respect. "You are a most intriguing enemy, human," the warlord growled. "This is far from over." Vega smiled, satisfied. We wouldn't have it any other way. As the Resolute continued deeper into Volcar space, the crew began to relax, if only slightly. They had bought themselves some time and earned a sliver of the Volcar's respect, but Vega knew they were just getting started. "We've shown them our hand," she muttered to herself. "Now we need to make sure they never forget it." The Resolute pressed onward, carrying humanity's hopes and its boldest gambit into the heart of enemy territory. In the distance, the Vulkar warships loomed like shadows, silently stalking their prey. But for the first time, they weren't the hunters. They were curious. And in that moment of curiosity, Vega saw the opportunity they needed, a crack in the armor of a race that feared nothing until now. The UN Resolute continued its journey deeper into Vulkar territory, escorted by a menacing formation of alien warships. Though Vega's daring maneuver had earned her crew a temporary reprieve, they knew the real challenge was only beginning. They were not just diplomats or soldiers. They were pioneers in uncharted waters, attempting to forge an alliance with a species that had never known peace. Warlord Zorvak had granted them safe passage, but the weight of his words still lingered in Vega's mind. This is far from over. That was both a warning and an invitation. The Vulkar didn't understand mercy. They understood only power, action, and intent. If humanity wanted to earn more than fleeting curiosity, they needed to demonstrate something far more difficult than strength: purpose. The next few days aboard the Resolute were spent in a tense quiet. The crew kept busy preparing for what lay ahead. Vega knew that they would soon reach the Vulkar outpost where their diplomatic mission would take place, and she could sense the anticipation building among her officers. Every moment counted. They had to play this perfectly, or the entire operation would unravel. Finally, the view through the ship's main display shifted as they entered orbit over the Vulkar stronghold, a massive station carved into a rocky asteroid. The structure loomed like a fortress from ancient times, bristling with weapons and defense systems. It was clear that this was not a place designed for peace. "Prepare for landing," Vega instructed, standing tall on the bridge. Her voice was calm, but everyone could feel the tension beneath the surface. "Remember, no weapons. We're here as guests." Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Park, adjusted his collar nervously. "With all due respect, Commander, how exactly do we negotiate with people who've only ever negotiated with plasma cannons?" Vega gave him a small, reassuring smile. "We don't negotiate. We engage." The Resolute docked in one of the outpost's cavernous bays. As the landing gears settled with a metallic hiss, Vega and her diplomatic team descended the ramp. The moment they stepped onto the cold, jagged floor, they were met by a procession of heavily armored Vulkar warriors, their towering forms casting long shadows across the docking bay. Each one wore the hardened expression of a predator evaluating its prey. At the center of the formation stood Warlord Zorvak, his armor dark and gleaming, his stance exuding power. Vega could feel his gaze upon her, as though he were trying to see through her every intention, every movement. This was the real test, not just of diplomacy, but of resolve. The Vulkar respected strength, yes, but strength of character mattered more than brute force. "You arrive without weapons," Zorvak observed, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "Bold or foolish?" Vega stepped forward without hesitation, meeting the warlord's gaze directly. "Both, perhaps, but we're still standing." A flicker of amusement crossed Zorvak's expression, so brief it might have been imagined. "Follow," he said gruffly, turning on his heel. The humans were led through the outpost, passing rows of Vulkar warriors, practicing in brutal training rituals. The walls were decorated with banners of conquest, each symbol representing a world taken and subdued under the Vulkar's relentless march. The station was more than a military base. It was a monument to victory, a place that celebrated dominance as the highest ideal. Zorvak led them to a war room where a massive table displayed holographic maps of nearby sectors. As Vega and her team took their seats, it was clear that the Vulkar had no intention of making them comfortable. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a silent but unmistakable challenge hanging in the air. "Convince us you are worth our time." Vega knew this wasn't just about words. Every gesture, every glance, every word spoken here would be weighed, and if the Volcar found her lacking, their fragile truce would shatter. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she had prepared for. "Warlord Zorvak," she began, "we're not here to change you. We respect who you are. You have built your legacy through strength and conquest, and there is honor in that." Zorvak raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. "Honor is earned, not given," he rumbled. "Exactly," Vega agreed, leaning forward. "And that's why we're here. You've faced many enemies, but not all enemies are the same. Some can be defeated with weapons, others—" She paused for effect, letting her words settle. "Are defeated through understanding." Zorvak tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "Understanding? What nonsense do you speak, human? We conquer. That is our way." Vega held his gaze steadily. "And what happens when there's no one left to conquer?" The warlord's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unspoken flashing across his face. It was a question he had never considered. For centuries the Volcar had known only one path, but now, for the first time, that path was being questioned. "You speak like a philosopher," Zorvak growled, though his tone was more curious than dismissive. "Yet your kind has proven capable in battle. Why do you not simply fight us?" Vega allowed herself a small smile. "Because fighting isn't the only way to prove strength." There was a long silence as the warlord mulled over her words. The tension in the room was palpable. Vega could feel the weight of every unspoken thought, every decision hanging in the balance. Finally, Zorvak leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Your words are strange, human, but you do not speak from weakness. For that you have my respect." Vega inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the subtle but significant shift. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. The warlord rose from his seat, signaling the end of the meeting. "You will stay here for now. There are still many things we must understand about each other." As the humans were escorted to their quarters within the outpost, Vega allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had taken the first step. The Volcar hadn't dismissed them outright, and that was more than anyone had expected. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, Vega knew that this was just the start of something far more complicated. Trust was fragile, and respect could be fleeting. If they were going to succeed, they needed more than words. They needed to show the Volcar that humanity's strength lay not in brute force, but in resilience, creativity, and purpose. For the first time in their long history, the Volcar had paused. They were beginning to see that the humans were different, that they fought battles not only with weapons, but with ideas. And in that pause, Vega saw the faintest glimmer of possibility, a chance to transform an ancient enemy into something far more valuable, an ally. The road ahead would be long and perilous, but for the first time it seemed that humanity and the Volcar were no longer enemies. They were something far more dangerous. They were curious about each other. For a fleeting moment it seemed as though the unthinkable might happen. Humans and Volcar, two vastly different species, might find common ground. But no great shift comes without resistance, and deep within Volcar society, cracks were beginning to form. Not everyone among the Volcar leadership embraced Warlord Zorvak's curiosity toward humanity. For many of the warriors under his command, the very notion of diplomacy was an insult to their traditions. And in the shadows, these dissenters plotted a way to put an end to the fragile peace before it could take root. The attack came suddenly, without warning. Atrax 9, a remote human colony on the fringes of civilized space, became the target of a rogue Volcar faction, one that refused to follow Zorvak's new path. The faction, led by a hardliner named Warlord Karth, had grown impatient with Zorvak's weakness. In their eyes, the only acceptable interaction with humans was one of conquest and annihilation. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a distress signal. The message was garbled, filled with static and bursts of frantic voices. "This is Atrax 9. We're under attack. Volcar ships." The signal cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. On board the UN Resolute, Commander Vega stood on the bridge, her expression hard as stone. She had known this peace was fragile, but even she hadn't expected it to shatter so quickly. "Get me a visual on Atrax 9, she ordered. The display screen flickered to life, revealing a grim scene. Volcar warships hovered in the skies above Atrax 9, launching devastating bombardments on the colony below. Explosions lit up the surface, and clouds of debris spiraled into the thin atmosphere. Civilians were fleeing, scrambling toward emergency shelters as plasma rounds tore through buildings and infrastructure. "Multiple enemy signatures confirmed," the tactical officer reported grimly. "At least 3 warships. Looks like Kreliths faction." Vega's jaw tightened. "Get me a secure channel to Warlord Zorvak." A tense silence filled the bridge as they waited for the connection. Vega knew that if Zorvak didn't respond, or worse, refused to act, they would have no choice but to engage the rogue faction alone. And with only a small escort fleet at their disposal, the odds were grim. Finally, the screen flickered, and Zorvak's face appeared. His expression was colder than usual, his sharp eyes gleaming with suppressed rage. "I know what you're going to say, human," he growled. "Kreliths acts without my authority." "That's not good enough," Vega snapped. "Innocent people are dying. If we don't stop this now, everything we've worked for will be lost." Zorvak's gaze hardened. "Do not presume to lecture me about control. Kreliths' actions are a betrayal of my command. He will answer for them, but I must handle this my way." "There's no time for your way," Vega shot back. "Atrax 9 won't survive another hour of this." For a long moment, Zorvak stared at her, as if weighing her words against the weight of centuries of tradition. Then, with a low growl of frustration, he made his decision. "I will send my fleet," he said. "But understand this, human. If you fight beside us, you fight under my command." Vega gave a curt nod. "Fine, just get your ships there. We'll hold the line until you arrive." As the transmission ended, Vega turned to her crew, her expression sharp and determined. "Prepare for battle. We're not waiting for permission to defend our people." The Resolute and its escort fleet jumped to Atrax 9's orbit, arriving just as the rogue Volcar faction began deploying ground troops. The colony was in chaos, buildings ablaze, civilians scattered, and the skies filled with the roar of alien warships. "Deploy fighters," Vega ordered. "Get the civilians to safety, and keep those ground troops contained. We can't let them overrun the colony." The Resolute's fighter squadrons launched into the fray, weaving through enemy fire with practiced precision. Though outnumbered, the human pilots used speed and cunning to outmaneuver the bulkier Volcar ships, landing precise strikes that disrupted enemy formations. On the ground, the situation was even more desperate. Human defense forces fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outmatched by the Volcar warriors, whose towering forms and advanced armor made them nearly unstoppable. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human soldiers held their ground, using every trick in the book to slow the enemy's advance. In the midst of the chaos, Vega knew they couldn't hold out forever. The rogue faction was too strong, too determined. If Zorvak didn't arrive soon, Atrax 9 would fall. "Commander, enemy reinforcements incoming," the tactical officer called out. "We're running out of time." Vega clenched her fists, every second feeling like a lifetime. Where was Zorvak? Had she gambled too much on his sense of honor? And then, just as all seemed lost, the Volcar warships on the horizon began to pull back, their movements faltering. Vega's eyes widened in disbelief until she saw what had caused the shift. Zorvak's fleet had arrived. The lead Volcar warship, A massive dreadnought bearing Zorvak's personal insignia cut through the battlefield like a storm, unleashing a barrage of fire that ripped through Kreliths' forces. The rogue faction, caught between two enemies, found themselves overwhelmed. "This is Zorvak," the warlord's voice growled over an open channel. "Kreliths' treachery ends here." The battle shifted rapidly after that. With Zorvak's forces now fighting alongside the humans, the rogue faction had no chance. Their ships were destroyed, their ground troops routed, and Warlord Krelith himself was captured, dragged in chains to face the wrath of his former leader. As the dust settled and the skies over Atrax 9 cleared, Vega finally allowed herself a breath of relief. They had won, but the cost had been high. Buildings lay in ruins, and the scars of battle would remain long after the fires were extinguished. In the aftermath, Vega met Zorvak on the war-torn surface of the colony. The Volcar warlord stood amid the wreckage, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the destruction caused by his own kind. "You fought well," Zorvak said quietly, "perhaps too well." Vega gave a tired smile. "We fight when we have to, but we prefer not to." Zorvak nodded slowly, a rare flicker of understanding passing between them. Kreliths' treachery was dealt with today, but many within my people still think as he did. This will not be the last challenge we face. "I never thought it would be easy," Vega replied, "but we took a step today, a hard one, and sometimes those are the only steps that matter." Zorvak turned to face her fully, his gaze sharp but respectful. "You have my respect, human, and my gratitude. Today you fought as one of us." Vega nodded, knowing that this was not just a compliment, it was the beginning of something far greater. As the remnants of Kreliths' forces were dealt with and Atrax 9's survivors began rebuilding, Vega felt a cautious hope stir within her. The battle had been brutal, but they had proven something important that day. Humans and Volcar could fight side by side and win. The road ahead would still be perilous, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But now at least they would not walk it alone. In the wake of the battle on Atrax 9, the bond between humans and Volcar shifted. Warlord Zorvak, once skeptical of humanity's intentions, had seen firsthand what humans were capable of, not just in terms of combat, but in their unwavering resolve to stand their ground. This was something the Volcar understood deeply. Not all strength was born from violence, and not all wars were fought on the battlefield. Respect had been earned, and with it came the opportunity for something no one had expected, a tentative alliance. The victory over Warlord Krelith's rogue faction was significant, but it was only the beginning. Both humans and Volcar knew that without a deeper understanding of each other, future cooperation would remain fragile. There was still a long road ahead, one paved with both opportunity and risk. Back aboard the Resolute, Commander Vega met with her senior staff. The meeting room was dimly lit, the hum of the ship's engines a subtle reminder of the fragile peace they were trying to maintain. "We've proven we can fight alongside them," Vega began, her voice steady. "But a single victory isn't enough to build trust. We need to make this alliance more than just a battlefield partnership. It has to mean something deeper, something lasting." Lieutenant Park, her second-in-command, leaned forward. Concern etched on his face. "You really think the Volcar are ready for that kind of relationship? They've spent centuries conquering everything in their path. Changing that mindset won't happen overnight." Vega nodded. "True, but we don't have to change who they are. We just need to show them that there's strength in cooperation too." The plan Vega proposed was audacious, a joint mission, one that would require Volcar and human forces to work together, not as rivals, but as equals. The mission would be more than a military exercise. It would be an opportunity to break down barriers and build mutual respect through action. When the proposal was transmitted to Zorvak, the warlord's initial response was predictably cold. He was not accustomed to collaboration, and the idea of coordinating with another species, especially one as young and unproven as humanity, was difficult to accept. But Zorvak was a pragmatist. He had seen the strength of the humans, and he knew that his people could benefit from this alliance, even if it meant challenging centuries of tradition. After a long pause, Zorvak agreed to the plan. "I will join this mission," he declared in his transmission. "But understand this, Commander Vega. If your people falter, the blame will fall squarely on you." Vega smiled faintly. "We won't falter." A week later, the joint Human-Volcar task force assembled on the Volcar homeworld, a planet known for its jagged mountains, dark skies, and massive fortresses that loomed like monuments to conquest. The mission was to neutralize a threat in a nearby system, an abandoned research station that had been taken over by rogue factions from both human and Volcar ranks. These factions, embittered by the idea of cooperation between their two species, had joined forces to sabotage any future peace efforts. On the surface, this mission was about eliminating a mutual threat, but for Vega and Zorvak, it was about far more than that. It was a chance to show their people that working together was not just possible, it was essential. The joint team gathered in the shadow of one of the Volcar's great citadels. Human soldiers stood alongside Volcar warriors, their differences stark, but their purpose shared. It was a strange and surreal sight. Two species that had, until recently, been on the brink of war, now preparing to fight together against a common enemy. Vega and Zorvak addressed the assembled troops side by side. The message was clear: trust your partner, fight as one, and leave no one behind. There was no room for old grudges on this mission, only the future. As the team boarded their dropships and launched toward the rogue-held station, tension filled the air. Old habits died hard, and both sides were still wary of each other. But as the dropships pierced the atmosphere and closed in on the target, a strange sense of unity began to take hold. They were here to fight, not each other, but together. The station loomed ahead, its skeletal structure glowing faintly under the light of distant stars. The rogue factions had fortified their position well, and the task force knew that the battle would be brutal. The mission was simple: infiltrate, neutralize, and secure the station. As soon as they landed, the battle erupted. Volcar warriors stormed the front lines with terrifying ferocity, their heavy armor and devastating weapons cutting a path through the enemy ranks. Human soldiers moved with precision, providing covering fire and flanking maneuvers that caught the enemy off guard. It was a strange but effective synergy, the Volcar's brute force complemented by the humans' tactical ingenuity. For the first time, they weren't just fighting as allies, they were fighting as a single unified force. Vega led a team through the station's narrow corridors, her pulse steady despite the chaos around her. Beside her, Zorvak moved like a predator, his every step deliberate and powerful. They worked in unison, covering each other's blind spots, advancing through enemy positions with a rhythm that felt natural, almost instinctive. At one point, the team encountered a heavily fortified choke point where rogue fighters had entrenched themselves behind barricades. It was the kind of obstacle that could stall a traditional assault for hours. "Suggestions?" Vega asked, glancing at Zorvak. The warlord grinned, a flash of sharp teeth glinting beneath his helmet. "Direct approach. Break their line." Vega smirked. "Thought you'd say that, but let's make it interesting." She quickly relayed her plan to the team, a coordinated strike that would combine the Volcar's brute force with the humans' precision. While the Volcar warriors charged head-on, drawing the enemy's fire, the human soldiers would deploy drones and explosives from the flanks, disrupting their defenses and forcing them into the open. The plan worked perfectly. The Volcar shattered the barricades with overwhelming force, and the human soldiers exploited the chaos to take control of the choke point. In less than 15 minutes, the enemy's defenses were in ruins, and the rogue fighters were either captured or neutralized. As the last of the resistance crumbled, Vega and Zorvak stood side by side, surveying the battlefield. The mission had been a resounding success, but the real victory lay in what it represented: two species, once enemies, now fighting as one. Back aboard the dropships, the mood was strangely light. Volcar and human soldiers exchanged nods of respect, and a few even shared quiet conversations, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. The ice had begun to thaw, and for the first time both sides saw each other not as rivals, but as comrades. When the task force returned to the Volcar homeworld, the victory was celebrated, not with grand parades or empty speeches, but with a simple acknowledgement. They had achieved something greater than just a military success. In the days that followed, Vega and Zorvak worked tirelessly to solidify the alliance, meeting with leaders from both sides to discuss the future. There were still challenges to overcome, still old wounds to heal, but the path forward was clearer now. As Vega stood atop one of the Volcar citadel walls, gazing out at the alien landscape, she knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, it was a road they would walk together. "You know," Zorvak said quietly, standing beside her, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm starting to think your people might be worth keeping around." Vega smiled. "Glad to hear it, because we're not going anywhere." And with that, the alliance was forged in fire, not just a partnership of convenience, but a bond built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. For the first time in centuries, the Volcar had found something greater than conquest, and together they and the humans stood ready to face whatever the future might bring. The monolith loomed before the combined fleet, an ancient, ominous structure glowing with unfamiliar glyphs, each pulse intensifying like the slow, deliberate rhythm of a beating heart. The gravitational distortions around it churned the void, throwing ships off their intended courses. Commander Vega stood on the bridge of the UN Resolute, staring grimly at the chaotic display projected before her. "This is beyond anything we've ever seen," whispered Lieutenant Park, his fingers flying over the console as he tried to make sense of the data. "I don't even know if we can fight it." Beside Vega, Warlord Zorvak observed the unfolding chaos in stoic silence. His sharp gaze scanned the monolith, and for the first time since Vega had met him, she saw a flicker of unease in his expression. The unknown made even the Volcar cautious, and that alone told Vega everything she needed to know. This was not just an anomaly. It was a threat on a scale they were unprepared for. "We've awakened something," Vega said quietly, half to herself. Suddenly, the strange signal shifted again, its rhythmic pulse accelerating into an erratic staccato. The glyphs covering the monolith blazed with harsh, blinding light, and the air on the bridge grew heavy with static. A low, thrumming sound reverberated through the ship, alien and incomprehensible, as though the very fabric of space was resonating with the monolith's power. Then the structure began to move. Massive panels on its surface slid apart with eerie precision, revealing a glowing core at its center, a sphere of writhing energy, pulsating with light and shadow. From that core, tendrils of plasma and darkness extended outward, wriggling through space like predatory limbs searching for prey. "All ships prepare to engage," Vega barked, her voice cutting through the tension on the bridge. The fleet responded in unison. Human and Volcar ships moved into formation, their weapons charging as they faced the ancient entity stirring before them. It was a strange sight, two races, once enemies, now standing together against a force beyond their understanding. The monolith's core pulsed again, and without warning, it released a massive wave of gravitational energy. The shockwave tore through space, throwing ships off course and disrupting shields. The Resolute bucked violently, alarms blaring as systems struggled to stay online. "Damage report!" Vega shouted, gripping the edge of the command console to keep her balance. "Shields holding, but barely," Lieutenant Park replied. "We've lost communication with 3 ships, and we're picking up anomalies across the sector." Vega cursed under her breath. This wasn't just a physical threat. The entity was disrupting space-time itself, bending reality to its will. If they didn't act fast, the fleet would be torn apart before they even had a chance to fight back. "Weapons online!" shouted the tactical officer. "Awaiting your orders, Commander." Vega hesitated for the briefest of moments. They didn't even know if their weapons would work against something like this. But there was no room for doubt. The only way was forward. "All ships, open fire!" she commanded. The void lit up with bursts of plasma, missile trails and energy beams as the fleet unleashed everything it had on the monolith. Human fighters swooped in, weaving between the writhing tendrils of the entity, while Volcar warships unleashed devastating barrages of plasma cannons and railguns. But the entity was far from defenseless. Its tendrils moved with impossible speed, swatting fighters out of the sky and wrapping around larger ships, crushing them like insects. Explosions blossomed in the dark, and the fleet struggled to maintain cohesion in the chaos. On the bridge of the Resolute, Vega gritted her teeth as the ship rocked from another impact. The monolith's core was absorbing their attacks, glowing brighter with every hit, as if it was feeding on the very energy they unleashed. "This isn't working!" Park shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "It's getting stronger." "We need a new plan," Vega muttered, scanning the tactical display for anything that could give them an edge. And then she saw it. The monolith's core, though protected by layers of energy, was connected to the outer structure by several glowing conduits. If they could sever those conduits... "Zorvak!" Vega called, turning to the Volcar warlord. "We need to cut off its power. Target those conduits, now!" Zorvak grinned, baring sharp teeth. "Finally, a challenge worthy of us." He relayed the orders to the Volcar ships, and moments later, the massive warships adjusted their fire, focusing on the glowing conduits linking the core to the monolith's outer shell. Plasma cannons roared to life, and energy beams carved through the void, striking the conduits with relentless precision. One by one, the conduits shattered, releasing bursts of energy that rippled across the structure. The monolith shuddered, its glowing core flickering as the flow of power was disrupted. "It's working," Park shouted, a hint of hope returning to his voice. "The core's destabilizing." But the entity wasn't done yet. With a final, desperate surge of energy, it released a gravitational pulse so powerful that space itself seemed to twist and ripple. The waves slammed into the fleet, and the Resolute systems flickered and dimmed, its hull groaning under the strain. For a moment, everything was still. Then the monolith's core imploded, a silent explosion of light and shadow that swallowed itself, leaving nothing but a fading ripple in its wake. As the battlefield fell silent, Vega allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had done it. The entity was gone, or at least whatever it had been was no longer a threat. "Status report," she ordered, her voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "Minimal casualties," Park replied, relief evident in his tone. "The fleet held." Vega turned to Zorvak, who stood beside her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two leaders said nothing, simply acknowledging the victory they had won together. "You fought well, human," Zorvak said at last. "Better than I expected." Vega smirked. "I could say the same about you." With the battle won and the threat neutralized, the joint fleet began the long journey back to known space. But even as they left the Vexy's expanse behind, Vega knew that this victory was just the beginning. They had faced the unknown and survived, but the galaxy was vast, and there were still many dangers waiting in the dark. As the stars stretched out before them, Vega allowed herself a rare moment of optimism. They had proven that humans and Volcar could fight together, survive together, and win together. And that, she knew, was more powerful than any weapon. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. And for the first time, it felt like hope wasn't just a possibility. It was a promise. The eclipse gate loomed against the backdrop of stars, a vast and turbulent region where gravity folded upon itself and collapsing stars drifted endlessly. It was here that the final stand would take place. The combined human and Volcar fleet waited in tense silence, knowing that the ancient entity they had encountered before was now more powerful than ever, and it was coming to consume everything in its path. Every pilot, commander, and soldier knew the stakes. If they failed here, the galaxy would be doomed. There would be no second chance. Vega stood on the Resolute's bridge, her expression cold and focused, masking the anxiety stirring inside her. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like never before. They were up against an enemy that defied comprehension, an enemy that thrived on chaos and destruction, warping the very laws of reality. This was more than a battle of weapons. It was a test of survival against a force that could unmake existence itself. "Fleet is in position," Lieutenant Park reported from the tactical station. He glanced at Vega, his hands tight on the controls. "All ships are standing by." Vega gave a slow nod. "Good. This is it." Standing beside her, Warlord Zorvac was a stoic presence, clad in dark armor that gleamed faintly under the bridge lights. He had fought countless battles across the galaxy, but this was different. Even he could sense it. There was something about this enemy that unsettled him, though he would never admit it aloud. "This battle will be our greatest test," Zorvac said, his voice low and rumbling. "We either emerge as victors or we become legends." Vega smiled faintly. "Let's aim for the first option." The tactical display flickered, and then the entity emerged from the rift, coiling through space like a massive storm. Tendrils of light and shadow twisted across the void, writhing in impossible patterns. Its core glowed with an eerie, otherworldly energy, pulsing like a malevolent heartbeat. The sight of it was mesmerizing and terrifying. "It's here," Park whispered. His voice held a trace of awe. "That thing is alive." "All ships, prepare to engage," Vega ordered. Her voice was calm, but every muscle in her body tensed. "This is what we've trained for. Stay sharp." The fleet surged forward, human and Volcar vessels moving as one. Fighters swarmed, weaving through the dark void, while cruisers and dreadnoughts unleashed devastating barrages of energy. Plasma bolts and missile trails lit up the darkness, streaking toward the entity's twisting form. The entity lashed back with terrifying force. Tendrils of energy whipped through space, snaring ships and crushing them like brittle toys. Fighters exploded in bursts of light, their pilots lost in an instant. The void was filled with the chaotic sounds of battle, the hum of engines, the crackle of energy weapons, and the distant, fragmented voices of commanders giving orders. The Resolute shuddered violently as a shockwave rippled through the fleet. Vega gripped the console to keep her balance as the lights flickered. "Shields holding at 70%, Park called out, though his voice was strained. "We can't take many more hits like that." "We have to hold," Vega snapped. "This thing feeds on fear and disorder. We keep fighting." Beside her, Zorvac studied the tactical display, his sharp gaze tracking the entity's movements. "It's testing us," he growled, "trying to break our formation." "Then we hit it where it hurts," Vega said. She tapped a section of the tactical map. "The core. That's where it's most vulnerable." Zorvac grinned. "A bold plan." "I approve." Vega turned to the crew. "All ships, concentrate fire on the core. Keep the pressure on. Don't let it regenerate." The fleet adjusted its formation, focusing all firepower on the entity's glowing center. Plasma cannons roared to life, and missiles streaked through the void, slamming into the core with relentless precision. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they might gain the upper hand. The core flickered, its glow dimming under the onslaught. But the entity was not so easily defeated. With a deafening pulse of energy, it released a massive gravitational wave, throwing the fleet into disarray. Ships spun out of control, their systems overloaded by the sudden disruption. "Stabilize the ship!" Vega shouted as the Resolute rocked violently. "Don't let it pull us apart." The crew scrambled to regain control, engines roaring as they fought against the gravitational forces. The battle was slipping away from them, the entity's power growing stronger with every passing second. "We need another plan," Park said, panic creeping into his voice. "We're not going to make it like this." Vega's mind raced. They couldn't overpower the entity by brute force. It was too vast, too alien. They needed something else, a strategy that the entity wouldn't expect. "Zorvak," she said suddenly, turning to the warlord. "We need to sever its connection to the rift. If we cut it off from its power source, it won't be able to sustain itself." Zorvak nodded, already grasping the idea. "You want to attack the conduits?" "Exactly," Vega confirmed. "We hit them hard and fast, then collapse the rift before it can recover." The warlord grinned, his sharp teeth flashing. "A dangerous plan." "I like it." Vega relayed the new orders to the fleet. "All ships, divert fire to the conduits. We're going to cut it off at the source." The fleet adjusted course, zeroing in on the glowing conduits that connected the entity's core to the swirling rift. Plasma beams and railguns tore through space, shattering the conduits one by one. Each burst of energy sent ripples through the entity's form, disrupting its structure. "It's working!" Park shouted. "The core's destabilizing!" But the entity fought back with renewed fury. Tendrils lashed out, wrapping around the Resolute and Zorvak's flagship, crushing their hulls with relentless force. Systems overloaded, sparks flying from the consoles as alarms blared. "Brace for impact!" Vega shouted, gripping the console as the ship groaned under the strain. Through the chaos, Zorvak's voice rang out like a battle cry. "Hold the line! We finish this now!" With one final desperate push, the combined fleet unleashed everything they had, a concentrated assault that tore through the remaining conduits and severed the core's connection to the rift. The entity let out a deafening, otherworldly scream as its form began to collapse, consumed by the very power it had tried to wield. The battlefield fell silent as the entity imploded, folding in on itself until nothing remained but the faint glow of fading stardust. The crew of the Resolute exhaled in unison, the weight of victory sinking in. They had done it. They had saved the galaxy. Vega leaned against the console, her heart pounding in her chest. "We made it," she whispered, half in disbelief. Zorvak grinned beside her, his expression one of hard-earned respect. "You fought well, human." Vega smiled, exhaustion creeping into her voice. "So did you." As the fleet regrouped and began the long journey home, Vega knew that this victory was more than just a battle won. It was proof that humans and Vulkar, despite their differences, could stand together and triumph. Whatever challenges the future held, they would face them as allies, side by side. And for the first time in a long while, Vega felt hope. The battle at the Eclipse Gate was over. The ancient entity that had threatened to unravel the galaxy was gone, collapsed into nothingness by the combined might of human and Vulkar forces. But victory came at a heavy price. The wreckage of ships drifted through space, silent reminders of the lives lost in the struggle. Although the galaxy had been saved, the task of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally, was only just beginning. Commander Vega stood on the bridge of the UEN Resolute, gazing at the debris field on the tactical display. The losses were staggering. Nearly a third of the combined fleet had been destroyed, with countless more vessels crippled and in need of repair. There was no triumph in her expression, only exhaustion and a lingering sadness for the lives that would never return. Beside her, Warlord Zorvak stared silently at the same display. He was no stranger to sacrifice, but even for a warrior of his experience, the sight of so much destruction was sobering. Yet there was no regret in his eyes, only a deep understanding that this battle had been necessary. "The battle is won," Zorvak said quietly, "but the true test begins now." Vega gave a small nod. "We need to rebuild. And more importantly, we need to prove that this alliance wasn't just about survival." Back at the Galactic Council, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in the vast central hall, many of them still processing the events of the Eclipse Gate. News of the battle had spread across the galaxy, along with reports of the human-Vulkar alliance that had stood against the ancient threat. For many council members, the victory was a revelation. It proved that cooperation between different races, no matter how unlikely, was possible. But others remained skeptical. The scars of the past were not easily forgotten, and old prejudices lingered beneath the surface. Vega and Zorvak stood side by side before the council, their presence a powerful symbol of the alliance they had forged in the heat of battle. Now, they had to convince the galaxy that the alliance should endure, even in the absence of war. The council president, an ancient being with shimmering blue scales, leaned forward from her elevated seat. "You have done the impossible," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "But wars have been won before, only for peace to crumble afterward. Why should we believe that your alliance will last?" Vega stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Because this alliance isn't just built on necessity, it's built on respect." She glanced at Zorvak, who gave her a subtle nod before speaking. "Humans are unexpected," he admitted, a rare note of humor in his voice. "They fight with more than weapons. They fight with ideas, and ideas once shared cannot be forgotten." The council chamber buzzed with murmurs as representatives exchanged glances, some intrigued, others skeptical. The alliance between humans and Vulkar was unlike anything they had seen before, a partnership that defied logic, born from battle but sustained by something deeper. "We've proven that together we're stronger than we ever could be apart," Vega continued. "The galaxy faces more than just wars of survival. There are challenges ahead that will require collaboration, creativity, and trust. We stand here today to say that humans and Vulkar are ready to face those challenges, side by side." In the days that followed the council session, the work of rebuilding began. Human and Vulkar fleets coordinated rescue missions to recover stranded ships and provide aid to damaged colonies. Engineers from both species collaborated on repairing starports and rebuilding communication networks disrupted during the entity's assault. It wasn't just infrastructure that needed rebuilding, it was trust. On many worlds, fear and resentment toward the Vulkar still ran deep. Stories of old conquests were not easily erased, and some feared that the alliance was a temporary truce, not a lasting peace. Vega knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to change hearts and minds. Actions would speak louder. And so, she and Zorvak set out on a diplomatic tour of the galaxy, visiting colonies, space stations and frontier worlds to meet with civilians and leaders alike. At first, the reception was mixed. On some planets, people cheered the arrival of the two leaders, grateful for the alliance that had saved them from annihilation. On others, they were met with suspicion, even hostility. Old wounds ran deep, and many found it hard to believe that a Vulkar warlord could ever be trusted. But slowly, as Vega and Zorvak listened to people's concerns and answered their questions with patience and honesty, the mood began to shift. At one colony, a young boy approached Zorvak cautiously, holding out a small hand-carved model of a Vulkar warrior. "Are you a hero?" the boy asked, his voice filled with awe. Zorvak knelt, taking the small figure in his large armored hand. "Heroes are not born," he said gently. "They are made through the choices they make every day." The boy smiled, and in that moment, something profound shifted, not just for the child, but for everyone who witnessed it. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of 1,000 battles. Meanwhile, joint cultural initiatives began to take root. Volcar martial traditions were introduced in human schools, while human art and philosophy found their way into Volcar education centers. Festivals celebrating both cultures became annual events, bringing people together to share food, music, and stories. For the first time, humans and Volcar weren't just allies, they were becoming friends. The effects of the alliance rippled across the galaxy. Other species, inspired by the example set by humans and Volcar, began forming their own partnerships. The Galactic Council, once a place of endless debates and political maneuvering, transformed into a vibrant forum for collaboration. There were still challenges, of course. Old grudges didn't disappear overnight, and some factions continued to resist the idea of cooperation. But with each passing day, the foundation of peace grew stronger. Back aboard the Resolute, Vega stood on the observation deck, watching as the stars drifted past. Zorvak joined her, his heavy footsteps echoing softly against the metal floor. "You've changed my people, human," Zorvak said quietly. "And you've changed me." Vega smiled. "The galaxy has a way of surprising us," Zorvak nodded. "Indeed, and I look forward to seeing what surprises lie ahead." The two leaders stood in silence for a moment, their friendship forged through battles won and challenges overcome. The future was uncertain, but for the first time it felt bright, filled with possibility, hope, and the promise of something new. As the Resolute continued its journey through the stars, Vega knew that the work of building peace would never truly end. But that was the beauty of it. Every day was a chance to create something better, to shape a future where strength was measured not by the battles fought, but by the friendships forged. And in the vast expanse of the galaxy, humans and Volcar stood ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. The vast expanse of space stretched before the UN Resolute as it cruised through the dark void, a beacon of hope in a galaxy that had seen both war and reconciliation. The alliance between humans and Volcar, once an unthinkable union, had become more than a pact. It had grown into a symbol of unity, inspiring cooperation among species who had spent centuries mired in conflict. But even as peace settled across the stars, Commander Vega knew that the journey was far from over. In the weeks following the Eclipse Gate victory, life slowly began to stabilize. The Galactic Council established new initiatives for cooperative exploration, diplomacy, and trade, driven by the lessons learned from the ancient entity's attack. Human and Volcar representatives worked side by side, drafting policies and developing joint military protocols to prepare for the unknown. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was focused not on expansion or conquest, but on building a lasting peace. Despite the achievements, Vega felt a weight on her shoulders, a nagging sense that this new era of peace was delicate. The battle against the entity had proven that unity was possible, but Vega knew that unity required constant work, trust, and vigilance. Would the peace last? Could old grudges stay buried, or would ancient resentments find their way back to the surface? On the observation deck of the Resolute, Vega stood alone, watching the stars drift by in silent elegance. The scars of the past were still fresh, etched into the hulls of damaged ships and the hearts of those who had lost loved ones. But there was also hope. Hope born from the knowledge that they had achieved the impossible. Footsteps echoed softly on the metal floor behind her, and Vega turned to see Warlord Zorvak enter the deck, his imposing frame silhouetted against the starlight. He carried himself with the same martial grace that defined his people, but there was a new weight in his gaze, something quieter, more reflective. "You still worry," Zorvak observed, stepping up beside her. Vega exhaled softly, her breath fogging the glass. "Peace is fragile," she admitted. "It's easy to win battles, harder to win the peace that follows." Zorvak grunted in agreement. "You speak truth, human. Peace is a challenge, but it is a challenge worth fighting for." Vega smiled faintly. "That's the first time I've heard a Volcar call peace a battle." Zorvak gave a rare chuckle, the sound low and rumbling. "Perhaps I've learned a thing or two from you." In the weeks that followed, the fruits of the alliance began to blossom. Human and Volcar joint fleets ventured into uncharted space, discovering new worlds and forging new relationships with alien civilizations that had long remained isolated. Scientific collaborations between the two species led to breakthroughs in medicine and technology, while cultural exchanges fostered mutual respect and understanding. On distant frontier worlds, Volcar warriors trained alongside human soldiers, teaching each other techniques that blended the strength of Volcar martial traditions with the agility and tactical ingenuity of human combat strategies. It was more than a simple exchange of skills. It was the creation of a new way of thinking. No longer were they warriors fighting to prove their dominance. Now they were protectors, working together to defend what they had built. At one of these training camps, a Volcar warrior named Kreliths approached a human soldier during a break between drills. The two had fought side by side during the battle at the Eclipse Gate, and their shared experience had forged an unspoken bond. "You fight well, human," Kreliths said gruffly, offering a rare compliment. "Not many would have lasted as long as you did out there." The human soldier grinned. "You're not so bad yourself. For a walking tank anyway." Kreliths rumbled with amusement, and in that moment the barriers between their species felt distant, a thing of the past. As the months passed, the alliance faced new challenges, but each one only strengthened the bond between humans and Volcar. Factions that had once opposed the partnership slowly began to fade into irrelevance, replaced by a new generation of leaders who embraced cooperation over conflict. In the Galactic Council, discussions about shared governance and exploration dominated the sessions. The council chambers, once a place of political tension and thinly veiled threats, had become a forum for collaboration. Old rivals worked side by side, united by a common vision of peace and progress. One of the most ambitious initiatives born from this new era was the Stellar Beacon Project, a network of stations placed across the galaxy, designed to provide aid, support, and refuge to any species in need. Each station was staffed by volunteers from different civilizations, including humans and Volcar, who served as medics, engineers, and peacekeepers. Vega and Zorvak visited the first completed station, a gleaming outpost named Unity Station, orbiting a distant star on the edge of explored space. As they toured the facility, they watched children from multiple species playing together in the central garden, their laughter filling the air. "It's strange," Vega murmured, watching the scene with a sense of wonder. "A few years ago, none of this seemed possible." Zorvak crossed his arms, his gaze thoughtful. "The past shapes us, but it does not define us. We shape the future." The legacy of the human-Volcar alliance soon became woven into the fabric of galactic history. Schools across the galaxy taught the story of the Eclipse Gate, not as a tale of war, but as a story of hope and unity, a story of two very different species who overcame their differences to save the galaxy. At one such school on Earth, a young student raised her hand during a lesson about the battle. "Do you think humans and Volcar will always be friends?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. The teacher smiled warmly. "I think it depends on what we choose to do with the peace we've built. It's up to us to make sure it lasts." In the years to come, That message would resonate throughout the galaxy. Humans and Volcar continued to explore the stars together, side by side, charting new paths and discovering new wonders. Their partnership became a symbol of what was possible when old grudges were set aside and new friendships were forged. As the Resolute prepared for its next mission, Vega stood once again on the observation deck, the familiar hum of the engines beneath her feet. The stars stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of how far they had come and how much more there was to discover. Zorvac joined her as he often did, his presence a comforting constant. "Where will you take us next, Commander?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. Vega smiled. "Wherever the stars lead us." Zorvac grinned. "Good. I look forward to the journey." And so the story of humans and Volcar became a legend that echoed across the galaxy. A story not just of survival, but of transformation. It was a story of two species who learned that strength lay not in conquest, but in cooperation, and that the greatest battles were not fought with weapons, but with hearts and minds. Together they faced the unknown, not as enemies or rivals, but as allies, explorers, and friends. And as they journeyed through the endless expanse of the universe, one truth became clear. The stars belonged to all of them together,